On March 11th, 1927, a well-organized and violent group of criminals orchestrated what has been described as the first successful robbery of an armored car in U.S. history. It was a period where the number of violent crimes and famous criminals was rising, owing perhaps largely to prohibition, which led rise to organized crime. Still, the 1927 Coverdale Brinks armored car robbery was a particularly violent episode in that violent era. There was a general increase in crime in the United States in the 1920s, owing possibly to the rise of organized crime during Prohibition, as well as the advent of the automobile, making for easy getaways. The website of the Federal Bureau of Investigation notes that dealing with the bootlegging and speakeasies was challenging enough, but the Roaring Twenties also saw bank robbery, kidnapping, auto theft, gambling, and drug trafficking become increasingly common crimes. On December 23, 1922, the Battle Creek, Michigan Moon Journal reported that a holdup wave gripped the nation as bank, payroll, safe, jewelry store are victimized by Christmas bandits. Perhaps the most shocking of these robberies was the ambush and murder of J.H. Dennis, who had been guarding the payroll for the Beetling Mine, known by the Pittsburgh Coal Company. According to the Moon Journal, Dennis, the company paymaster, had been riding a motorcycle ahead of a car carrying the mine superintendent and 2 other employees, an advance guard for the mine payroll that was being carried from Pittsburgh to the mine. In the area of Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, several armed men, their faces covered with blue handkerchiefs, stepped out and without warning shot Dennis and proceeded to stop the following car and demand the payroll at gunpoint. The men made off with $19,400. Dennis died on the way to the hospital. Nearly $20,000 was a good haul, but the robbery represented a potential first. As the New York Daily News reported in 1929, it was the first big job in which Paul Jaworski was known to have taken part. Born around 1900 in, depending upon the source, either Poland or Russia, the news reported that very little is known about the young man's earlier career, but he seems to have passed through the usual period of petty thievery and burglary before graduating into the highway robbery class. By the time of the Christmas robbery, the news writes, Jaworski had either formed or become the leader of a gang called the Flathead Gang. Again, the early details are unknown. According to his 2008 book, Detroit's Infamous Purple Gang, historian Paul R. Cavieth writes that the gang was a mob of bank robbers and safecrackers operating out of the Detroit area. When things got hot in southeast Michigan, the group moved their operations to Pennsylvania. Possibly the gang's name, which Cavieth says was used in the East, was an allusion to the strangely squarish, flat-top shape of Jaworski's head. But the news notes the robbery was a complete success. The theft and murder of Dennis would not be tied to Jaworski and the gang for many years. His first actual connection with the police, the news argues, came in early 1924. He had attempted single-handedly to rob a saloon in a suburb of Pittsburgh and shot a young woman in the shoulder. Something, the news opines, that was typical of him, as he was seldom one to hesitate pulling the trigger. He was, in turn, shot in the chest by the bar owner. Arrested under the alias Paul Palmer, he for a month hovered between life and death, but eventually recovered. He was allowed bail, which he got from a bondsman, and, the news writes, he disappeared as soon as he was released. Ironically, the news writes, Jaworski had been held in a cell opposite an Italian man who had been wrongly arrested for the murder of Dennis, which would later be identified as the work of Jaworski. The gang pulled off another Christmas robbery on December 24, 1925, this time ambushing a mine paymaster in rural Pennsylvania, and this time killing a 60-year-old mine guard named Isaiah Gump and making off with 2 bags containing $48,000. The gang might have been involved in other robberies, but these early crimes were merely a build-up to what the news called the gang's master stroke. The Brinks Company began as the Brinks Chicago City Express Company in 1859. By 1919, they had expanded beyond Chicago, were known as the Brinks Express Company. The company purchased its first motor vehicle for delivery in 1904. The increased violence of robbery compelled the company to first start using refurbished school buses with armored sides in 1917 and later purpose-built fully armored cars to carry valuable cargo by 1923. The armored trucks used a standard wooden chassis with wooden floors and steel plating on the body panels. Still, they represented a formidable obstacle to thieves. Prior to 1927, there had been no successful robbery of an armored truck in the United States, but the Flathead Gang had a plan and a penchant for violence. The Bloomington, Illinois Pantogram reported on March 12, 1927. Planting dynamite bombs expertly under a highway, 9 bandits wrecked 2 armored automobiles by setting off explosives as they passed. The 2 vehicles were described as an armored truck carrying the money and a lighter escorting car. The Chicago Tribune explained, starting out with $175,000 in the armored truck, $73,000 had been delivered to 2 mines when the 2 machines, the second acting as an escort, left the Library Road, a main highway, and turned onto the Old Bethel Road to deliver the Coverdale mine payroll, 9 miles from Pittsburgh. While the initial report was that the robbers had used dynamite, it was later determined that they had stolen 500 pounds of black powder from the powder room of an area mine the day before. That is enough for an enormous blast. The Tribune writes, as the cars passed over them, the 2 bombs, about 30 feet apart, were set off with an electric battery by the bandits hidden nearby. Both cars were blown into the air, overturning as they fell, shattered wrecks, near holes several feet deep in the ground. Police later discovered 2 wires leading from the 2 craters in the road to a rotted tree in a field 100 yards away. Altogether, the vehicles had carried 5 men, 3 in the armored truck and 2 in the car following. Surprisingly, despite the size of the blast and the fact that the cars were literally thrown into the air and shattered, none of the men were killed, although the Boston Globe reported that most of the 5 drivers and guards of the 2 cars were knocked unconscious by the blast. All of the custodians of the money were injured, one seriously. W.H. Tarr, the driver of the truck, recalled, suddenly I heard a thump and then a bump that lifted the car up into the air, and our heads struck the roof of the armored machine. The next I remembered, I was lying in the roadway, dazed. Lester Studunger, who was driving the car 30 or 40 feet behind the money truck, recalled, I remember a little thump and then a bump as the blast went up. That was the last I remembered until I was taken to a physician's office. The thump, the Globe surmised, was the sound of the vehicles driving over the wires, the bump being the explosions. The armored truck had been shattered, torn open, and the robbers were able to easily collect the money inside. Tarr, although dazed, tried to get up when he said a young man who looked like a foreigner came up and pointed a gun at Herbster, who had been in the passenger seat, and me, and ordered us to lie with our faces downward while the others of the gang robbed the car. When, the Tribune notes, miners and persons nearby, attracted to the explosions, hurried to the scene and found the wrecked machines and injured men, they found that all the nearby phone wires had been cut, preventing them from notifying police. The news later reported that it was necessary to drive to another town in order to give the alarm. By that time, the bandits were well out of that part of the country. By evening, the Tribune reported, all officers in western Pennsylvania sought the robbers, who were reported to have escaped in 2 automobiles. The Daily News noted that the location of the robbery, in a lonely stretch of country, was not more than a mile from the spot where Gump had been killed, and less than 5 miles from the scene of the Dennis slaying. It was a well-planned robbery, netting $102,000, but there was a problem. Cap, while being told to keep his face down, had looked up long enough to remember the license plate number of one of the cars. The news takes up the story. Detectives traced one of the cars far into the rural district of Washington County. One of the robbers' cars had blown out a tire, but the gangsters had not stopped to fix it. That might have stymied the police, but the news writes, this time the Flatheads were not so lucky. It turns out that a witness had noticed a crowd of suspicious-appearing foreigners in a section not far from where the tracks had ended, and that tip led police to a hideout, later found out to have been established years earlier by the gang. The news reported within an hour, Paul Jaworski stood handcuffed on the porch of a farmhouse in Washington County. It was a unique turn of bad luck for Jaworski. The rest of the gang, 9 men had been involved in the robbery, had decided to quickly go back to Detroit until the chase died down, but Jaworski had just murdered a police officer in Detroit and decided he needed to stay away. He was alone in the hideout when the police found him, and the hideout was, it seems, full of incriminating evidence. In addition to a quantity of dynamite and automobile parts, Jaworski had in his possession $54, 2 $20 bills, a $10 and 2 $2 bills. The bills were crisp and new and had serial numbers just a few off from the money that had been delivered to the first 2 mines. Alfred Dockery noted on his blog, Lessons from History, if Jaworski had been caught with a Wile E. Coyote-style blueprint showing the Brinks cars, the road, the bombs, an anvil, and the Roadrunner, he would not have looked less guilty. Still, Jaworski tried to play dumb, saying he knew nothing about the robbery. The police turned to deception. They showed him a telegraph that he'd gotten from Detroit, saying that his photograph was the man wanted for the murder of a Detroit police officer. But then they showed a second telegram saying that the owner of the property, named Joseph Wachowski, had been arrested and had confessed. It was a ploy, and the police were banking on Wachowski's involvement. It worked. The news writes Jaworski, reading it, closed his hand angrily on the slip of paper and uttered an oath. Within a few minutes, he admitted having taken part in the robbery. Jaworski not only confessed, but he led officers to a buried milk can containing $36,000 in the stolen money and implicated 4 men in addition to Wachowski. Only then was Wachowski actually arrested in Detroit. Jaworski eventually pled guilty to both the armored car robbery and the 2 payroll robberies, including the murders of Gump and Dennis. In May, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Isaiah Gump. The other members of the gang were being hunted down and the bulk of the stolen money retrieved. It would seem that the Flathead gang was finished. But they weren't. The following August, Jaworski was being held in the Allegheny County Jail awaiting sentences on the Dennis murder charge. His brother Sam came for a visit and somehow smuggled in 4 automatic pistols. The brothers, along with another prisoner named Jack Vasbinder, drew the guns on the startled guards, wounding 2 of them, and acquired the keys from the jail's bookkeeper. The news writes, they unlocked the big steel doors leading into the street, walked unhurriedly to a car nearby, and sped away. It was, the news opines, one of the most daring and spectacular jailbreaks in Pittsburgh history. Despite a manhunt, Jaworski managed to stay on the lam. On June 25th, a group of robbers robbed the office of the Detroit Free Press. 5 men walked into the building around noon, carrying paper bags. They walked to the business office and pulled shotguns from the bags, demanding the money for the paper's payroll. Men made off with $14,826, but on their way out of the building encountered Detroit patrolman Sergeant George Barstad, who was shot to death on the steps of the building. Police quickly sought Jaworski in the crime, the Daily News reporting this was a Jaworski job. Once again, the robbers had made off with the cash, but time was running out for Flathead Paul Jaworski. On September 13th, he was eating lunch at a counter in Cleveland, Ohio. Unbeknownst to him, another patron recognized him, having known him as, the Daily News writes, a youth. The Detroit Free Press reported, the Detroit gangster and escaped convict was surprised while eating after an informant told police that a murderer, wanted in several cities, was in a restaurant at 6418 Fleet Street. But when officers arrived, Jaworski pulled his gun and started shooting, killing an officer, wounding a second officer, and striking a bystander outside. A wild chase began. Jaworski ran out the back door and down an alley, pursued, the Detroit Free Press notes, by passerby and 2 other patrolmen. He ran to an apartment building. He was trapped. The Free Press writes a crowd estimated at more than 500 had assembled. A riot call to several precinct stations brought machine gun and shotgun squads with tear bombs. It was a dangerous situation. The Free Press reports hundreds of children made targets of themselves as the dead-eyed thug fired from every possible corner of the house at the police. Authorities remarked that it was pure chance that many more persons were not hit by the score of bullets that flew all directions. The Daily News writes a brief siege and it was all over. Tear bombs finally forced him to come out. As he stepped out of the door, Jaworski was peppered with buckshot and he fell, wounded in a half-dozen places. The Free Press reported that he told officers, "Don't care if I die." In the hospital, Jaworski confessed to several robberies and 6 murders. The Daily News wrote that 3 states wanted to try him and execute him for murder. Pennsylvania finally got the assignment. He was executed by electric chair, January 21st, 1929. The news writes, he calmly took his seat, as calmly as if he was sitting down, to have his hair cut. The rest of the members of the gang were eventually tracked down, served various prison sentences. In the end, the Flatheads were just another violent gang in a time of such men. Perhaps their greatest legacy was that their robbery prompted the security industry to develop new protocols and stronger armored cars with steel bottoms better able to withstand explosions. One of Jaworski's last acts was to write a letter to a district attorney confessing to one more murder, that of Jack Vasbinder, the man with whom he'd escaped from Allegheny Prison. He said that Vasbinder was a dope addict and that the two had argued. He killed him with a shotgun, threw the body in a river. He ended the letter with a note that perhaps encapsulated the life of Paul Jaworski and maybe the entire time. He said, "See you at 49 Hell's Fire Road, 10 miles beyond hell." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.